But obviously the focus of this inquiry is on about learning the lessons of what's happened over the last couple of years. Surely one of the lessons that we should learn is when the EU has said something, it has meant it. 100% of the way, the British government has said, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? Or, well, they're just playing politics, or, well, they're just posturing, or whatever phrase you may wish to choose. But in fact, that is precisely what has ended up happening. And all the way through, anyone who's just tried to sort of point out this is the reality of these negotiations has either been accused of talking the country down or being a naysayer. But in fact, the lesson to be learned from all of this is that when the EU says what it means what it says. Wouldn't you agree with that?
No, I think you've had a variety of tweets, off-the-cuff remarks. I think of the Salzburg conference, where there was off-the-cuff remarks made, and then a number of other senior figures across Europe coming back and saying, hold on, that is not correct and not helpful. I think it's the part and parcel of a negotiation that you get press conferences, tweets, comments relayed via select committees in order to toughen up the position, and it doesn't accurately reflect the substantive negotiating position, not least because the EU is not one homogenous whole. Indeed, the Commission isn't. It has a whole variety of different views, and even more so when you spread across European capitals.
Can you give an example of a substantive example of where the EU has said something of importance, say, for example, around the backstop or whatever issue you may choose, which hasn't in the end ended up being precisely the position that the British government has had to accept?
Well, it was being bandied around that we'd pay 100 billion in the finance settlement. It's now 39 billion, so there's one.
Okay, thanks very much. On the issue of the backstop, last week Sabine Veillant said on the record that negotiators had looked at every border on this earth and every border the EU has with a third country, and there was simply no way that you can do away with checks and controls. Do you think that's just sort of empty rhetoric as well?
Well, I heard an interesting anecdote, and I'll have to protect the source of it, whereby the point was made to UK officials at a very senior level that given the porous nature of the border on the Mediterranean, given the finite length and nature of the challenges on the border between the Republic and Northern Ireland, if the situation in the Mediterranean borders was tolerable, it was not beyond the wit of man and woman, with the goodwill of the Irish, British and governments and the Commission, to resolve this problem. So I'll respect the integrity of how I learnt about that, but I think it rather addresses the concern that Sabine Veillant had. Thanks very much.
On just one final question, on the assumption that some sort of deal passes between now and the 29th of March, it's clearly the case that we would have to pass the Withdrawal Agreement implementation bill in order to be able to leave the European Union. Do you think that it's possible or credible to do that without having to have an extension beyond the 29th of March?
I think it looks very challenging. Whether it's physically possible, it would depend how much you're willing to extend the sittings. I am, at least at this point, open-minded, or at least not opposed to at least the possibility of a modest extension by, let's say, a week or two, if we had an acceptable deal to the United Kingdom in order to put through the relevant legislation. I don't think that's going to be the deal breaker on our side.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, I wanted now to turn to this question of the Ministerial Code, the Cabinet Manual, and the very important and extremely clear statements in it regarding the taking of the law officers' opinions, because we've had a lot of correspondence with and I've had many exchanges with the Prime Minister over this, both on the floor of the House and in the Liaison Committee. And I'd just like to ask you a straight question on this. given the importance of these issues, why is it that you think we are only left with one opinion dated the 13th of November, which is described anyway as being an evolving text, or at any rate describing the advice as being based on an evolving text? I mean, it seems to me absolutely astonishing, and I just want to ask you a question. Would you not agree as a lawyer in your own right, that when you're dealing with matters of this importance and the legal issues that arise, astonishing that neither a legal opinion was sought on many of the questions which are careering through the system over the last few months, or indeed that the advice may not have been offered? Can you just throw any light on this? It seems to me quite an astonishing state of affairs.
So, first of all, on the point of principle, I actually think it's wrong to publish the actual legal advice. And I say this as a former Foreign Office lawyer. I think what we really want is the most candid and robust legal advice given to ministers and the Prime Minister of the day. I think it's perfectly acceptable, and we had a similar debate during the Iraq War, for a summary of the legal opinion to be given in order to clarify the issues on which Parliament rightly is interested. But I want to preserve the space for Attorney Generals to give as candid and clear advice without fear or favour. That's my own personal view. But I obviously respect that Parliament has decreed or demanded otherwise. On the secondary question, within that umbrella and within that safe space, legal advice was solicited and provided all the time. I spoke to the Attorney General regularly.
In written form as well?
Yes.
You see, this is where the problem lies, because we have a very clear resolution of the House of Commons where the issue of contempt was raised and dealt with by resolution of the House. And the motion itself, I took part in the debate, quite clearly stated the full and final legal advice with regard to the withdrawal agreement. So far, we've only got this one letter, which is couched in rather vague terms. But you tell us that there is a lot more, and yet it doesn't appear anywhere, despite the fact that the House of Commons, whether you like it or I like it, whether the government likes it or otherwise, quite clearly stated in that resolution that the advice must be published. Where is it?
Well, first of all, that was the last piece of formal advice that was provided, and it preceded my resignation, so I can't speak to what any further evolution of it subsequently.
No.
And previously, there's a whole range of advice that was provided for me, but more than often, I would either call the attorney or formally ask for him to come up with solutions or to bounce ideas off him, so that every step of the way what we were doing was couched with a clear understanding of what the legal implications were, so that without putting aside the rights or wrongs of demanding to see legal advice in public, and I've said my reason, is that ministers could give clear statements to the House of Commons about what the position would be, so that Parliament and the public had a very clear view of the position without it being subject to suspicion or the rest of it. But I don't know what was provided after my resignation.
Yes, so I'm not quite sure about the timing of this question in relation to what you just said, but one thing which is clear to me as a former Shadow Attorney General and very interested in this question of the law officer's opinions, it seems to me that first of all you'd expect them to be there and you confirm that they are. But secondly, there's one fundamental question which I raised at the beginning on the 9th of July, actually, after the Chequers, and I've raised it again several times with the Prime Minister, and that is the compatibility of the Section 1 of the Withdrawal Act, which got royal assent on the 26th of June last year, and the withdrawal agreement, because they're just incompatible. You can't say on the one hand that you're going to repeal the 1972 Act and then have a withdrawal agreement which under Article 4 and various other parts of the withdrawal agreement quite clearly invades that space So the withdrawal agreement itself is not a signed document, it's not an international treaty, hasn't in fact been endorsed by an act of parliament. So we're in this strange position where one would have expected as a very minimum that the Attorney General would say it is impossible to reconcile those two positions.
Well, I haven't seen the formal advice from the attorney on this in relation to the bill, but I do think it was inevitable, or at least highly likely, that the EU Withdrawal Bill and Act was passed before the negotiations on the implementation period were concluded, and it is that bit of the negotiation that required what, in layman's terms, would be regarded as a savings clause, which brings the dilemma that you've raised into focus. But I can't talk that in any greater. So I don't think it's surprising that we've had that challenge. And I think when the EU Withdrawal Act or Bill was brought through the House of Commons, I was asked about this. I was brought onto the Bill team from the Ministry of Justice, and I remember it being discussed. But I don't have the details in front of me to be able to address any more of that.
But are you now telling me that there is no opinion anywhere in the archives or anywhere in the correspondence between the ministers, the Prime Minister or anybody to try and give an answer, legal answer to that very simple question?
Oh, I'm sure there must have been legal advice, whether it came from the attorney or otherwise, I couldn't say off the top of my head.
Kelvin Hopkins, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Mr. Raab. There has been some disquiet that Cabinet Ministers may not always have had access to the full range of papers, information, etc., in sufficient time to be making informed decisions on Brexit. Now, Chairman Sir William was sufficiently concerned about this to write to the Prime Minister about it. But during your time as Secretary of State, were you content that information required to enable ministers to make informed decisions on Brexit matters was always made available to them in a timely manner?
Speaking for myself, when I got information, it was always in a timely manner.
And secondly, could the process of disseminating information to ministers have been better handled, and would this have made a difference to the conduct or outcome of negotiations?
I think you'd have to ask other Cabinet members, and I know that some of the disquiet you've described was felt more widely. The dissemination of, as the Secretary of State for Dexter at the time, getting the papers on time and having enough time to read them wasn't really the issue.
One thing that comes to mind, of course, is before your time as Secretary of State, but at the Chequers discussions over the weekend, the actual paper setting out the proposal, the document, wasn't provided to Cabinet members till late in the weekend, with not enough time to read it. Well, is that the case?
Well, I think with respect, Mr. Hopkins, I wasn't there at the time, so I can't answer that question. Well, the obvious illustration that I can point to is paragraph 23 of the political declaration, which was changed at the last minute, effectively to make the backstop the front stop. There's been a lot of debate around that paragraph. I was very surprised to see that change the night before the epic cabinet meeting that we had the day before my resignation. And that's the only example I can think of where something clearly had changed substantively without my knowledge, let alone my agreement.
Well, thank you. I accept your position clearly, but as to Chequers, there was a lot of press comment, and clearly some Cabinet members were leaking what had happened, and I think that was something that we were worried about. Anyway, thank you.
My pleasure.
Richard Jacks.
Just quickly on this point about legal advice, it seems from what some Cabinet Ministers have said and continue to say, should we say, of a Remain-oriented nature, that they are sometimes ill-informed. At the Cabinet meetings that you sat at, which lasted, half an hour, presumably the detail that you had, they didn't have. And did you find, when you were there, that you were surprised at the lack of depth of knowledge, perhaps, on such an important issue when Cabinet Ministers are speaking to the press and to the public?
Well, I think
beyond the collective responsibility of the Cabinet.
The two biggest Cabinet meetings, which went on, I think both of them the one on no-deal planning, which was in September, I think went on for 3 hours. The one on the deal, the day before I resigned, was 5 hours. I don't think in relation to either of those meetings was anyone unsighted. Indeed, I think the arrangements were made to make sure that all the papers were disseminated and time was allocated for a proper chance to read the papers in advance. In relation to broader issues that arose, I think you'd have to ask those other cabinet members. All I know is that, as Secretary of State, the receipt and consumption of material wasn't the problem.
Just my point is that the information that comes out about how we're all going to hell in a handcart and planes won't fly and all the rest of it, it's got to come from somewhere. And as we now know, a lot of the information we've been given is just not true.
Well, there are leaks, and that's entirely reprehensible and a clear breach of the civil service and indeed ministerial code. In relation to the technical notices, and I think we put out, if I'm correct, 106 over the period between August and October, all of those were checked at ministerial level. In my case, I would check them 2 or 3 times and push back where I didn't agree or test assumptions. But the scare stories have not been derived from those 106 technical notices. Indeed, they were designed to inform, advise and reassure. The scaremongering has come from leaks or indeed non-governmental sources. I think that's correct.
Yes, we are running a little short on time with the next witness waiting, but there is one question I do want you to answer, if you'd be kind enough, and it relates to the question of the issue of laws, and we're speaking here, you're speaking here, we're discussing this with you as the European Scrutiny Committee, and we have, since the 1970s, this committee has been involved in the scrutiny of laws coming from Europe. Every single law that comes through comes to us after it's been through the Council of Ministers and during the process of discussion and negotiation. Those laws then become the law of this country through Section 2 of the European Communities Act. Now, the trouble is that under the transitional period, it is clear under Article 4 of the Withdrawal Agreement that we are going to be faced with laws that are made by majority vote of the other 27 member states, or by consensus between them, behind closed doors, without a transcript, so nobody will know the basis on which it's all been done. And for a period of maybe up to 3 years, this country is going to be imposed with laws which are going to be made by other countries. Never before, to use your analogy with British history, has this ever been done in our entire history before. So the question I ask you is, what do you really think about this as a principle? The idea that we should allow during this transitional period, which will also create vast uncertainty for business, because the rule book and indeed the whole of our legal system is going to be affected by the decisions that are taken. They're going to impose the laws on the United Kingdom, and the degree surely to which the business community is going to be affected by changes that may make us very uncompetitive, might put us at the mercy, will, I think, in my opinion, put us at the mercy of our competitors. What is your reaction to that? And do you think that it's justified under any circumstances? And if so, what are they?
The only point I would disagree with you on, Mr. Chairman, is that you said it would apply for 3 years. Unless we get an exit from the backstop, it could be indefinite. I
said for at least 3 years.
At least, I stand corrected. Well, you see, there's the optimist in you, Mr. Chairman, but what I'm worried about is that...
I'm on the record as saying I think it could go on indefinitely.
That's what worries me. It's entirely indefensible, both in principle and in practice.
Yes. So you would find yourself in a position of just simply having to say this withdrawal agreement, for the reasons that you've given during this session, and in particular the control over laws as well, really makes it a no-go area. This withdrawal agreement is substantially defective for those reasons, and perhaps some others as well.
This was the basis on which I resigned, so of course I'd vote against it.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I think we have actually got to move on now, because it's now just nearly quarter to 4. No, I'm afraid we can catch up with Theresa May later. Thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure. Thank you.